Good evening, Earth. This is Adam Sturch broadcasting from the Mushroom Mansion, Dallas, New Mexico, working on oil painting abyssal lights. Alright, I'm going to continue developing the figure with another layer of glaze, this time a lemon yellow, translucent with some liquid, and a lighter yellow, and a little bit of white to work on the highlights.
The wisdom of healing that's inside of ourselves?
Alright.
Well, that's it. There's a wisdom in the body which allows healing and even new development to take place, even later on in life. The longer we've done drugs, the longer it takes, and the more support you need. But there's nobody beyond redemption. There's nobody beyond redemption. Now, how long will it take? You see, you're not just talking about the effects of the drugs, you're also talking about a lifelong trauma. So when you talk about healing addiction, it's not just getting somebody to stop using the drugs. It's also developing new ways of coping and new ways of thinking about themselves and new ways of seeing the world that they never had from their early life because the conditions weren't appropriate. So let me say something here about the past and the generations. The thing that I said about what's necessary for the healthy development of the person and the brain, the kind of parenting, that's exactly the way, as far as we understand it from historians and anthropologists, and from stories of the elders. That's exactly the way First Nations people used to parent their kids. Kids were not parented in isolated families. They were part of a village. In the village, it wasn't just a question of mommy and daddy, it's a question of the whole community was responsible for the child. The child had many, many adults around to protect them and to nurture them and to teach them. Kids were never separated from the adults. They were carried everywhere the parents went. The kids went with them. Just the kind of things that science is now discovering we need to do to nurture kids. People were doing it automatically without science, without brain scans, without all this stuff. They were just doing it. And that's why Aboriginal people, by the way, parent everywhere in the world under natural conditions. And then you look at what happens. And there was actually substances in North America that could have been addictive. There was tobacco here. There was alcohol in southern United States. There was peyote. But there was no addiction. There was no problem with drug use, even though some drugs were here. And it's the same with coca in Latin America. There was no severe addiction problem. So addiction problem comes along when you destroy people's ways of life. That's when it comes along. It's so simple. You can predict it. In the Western world, there was alcohol for thousands of years. There was drunkenness. People get drunk on holidays and festivities, but there was no alcoholism until the Industrial Revolution, when people were chased away from their villages and their communities, and they had to go into cities, and now they were isolated away from their families and controlled and beaten and so on, so no longer living under the natural conditions. That's when the addiction comes along. I don't want to say that you can't do anything about it, because you can. You did individually. And people do on a community level. But it's very difficult, because there's a whole history that weighs down on you. And it's not just the history, it's still going on. I mean, if you actually look at what's going on, it's not like all the land things have been settled. It's not like there's no more discrimination. It's not like governments are now being fair about it. No, a lot of this exploitation and so on is still going on. And there's a lot of infighting, and I don't have much to say about that because I'm not part of it, but corruption and so on that happens in some of the First Nations organizations and so on. It's a very, very difficult situation. I have no idea how to resolve the problem. All I can say is, on a social level, Canadian society needs to do a lot more. Needs to do a lot more. Apologies are just not enough. We need to do a lot more. But just me saying it isn't going to make it happen. And Stephen Harper has never phoned me to ask me what he should do. I don't get it, personally, but he hasn't. But communities are going to have to find some creative response that this trauma has been going on. You know, and maybe where words can help is only with this. Maybe it can help with the shame part. Because there's tremendous shame associated with abuse. Maybe if people get it, that it's not their fault, that it just happened. They didn't create it, they didn't call for it, they didn't ask for it. It might be their responsibility now. I mean, whatever addiction issues exist in this community here, you can wait for Stephen Harper to come and do something about it, but I wouldn't hold your breath too much. So it's your responsibility, and you have to respond. But maybe if you get that, it's not your fault. Maybe you get that the shame that's associated with addiction, maybe you can drop the shame. Maybe if you drop the shame, that'll help lift the weight off your shoulders a bit so you can get on with it. Maybe it's the shame that keeps people stuck. The attunement piece is a big one. Attunement means when two people, when one person gets the emotional space of another person and is able to communicate that I get it. Now with babies we do this all the time. When the baby starts crying, we attune right away. What do we do? What do you do when you see a baby crying? What happens to your face? Oh, you know. So you're communicating that. Okay, baby, I get it. You're feeling sad. I get that you feel sad. I feel sad too when you feel sad. That's attunement. Now we all need that. The children need it for their development. When a parent is not attuned to the child, then the kid doesn't get the feeling of being received and understood. So they get the sense that there's something wrong with them. Even if the parents never beat them or hurt them, just because if they were stressed and when parents are stressed, they can't be attuned because they're too stressed. And that's why that EEG, where the depressed mother, or the infants where the mothers are depressed, you could tell from the child's brain whose mother was depressed and who wasn't, because the mothers weren't attuned to the child. Now, in terms of dealing with addiction, then, given that the first condition that was lacking was this attuned presence of caregivers, what do you think the first condition is if we're going to heal people? The same thing. It's not enough to tell people that you got to stop doing this, it's bad for you. People need, first of all, some loving acceptance in their lives. They need to be given a message that their addiction may not be okay, but they're okay. That it's not their fault. That they're not stupid, that they're not deficient. That there's nothing to be ashamed of. Nobody woke up at 3 years of age and said, I'm going to become a drug addict. Nobody woke up at 15 years of age and said, I'm going to become a drug addict. People drifted into it. They drifted into it because of all the stuff that I talked about. So we have to lift the shame, and the only way we lift the shame, see, drug addicts are very ashamed of themselves. Anybody here who's ever had an addiction problem, you know how ashamed you were, and how poisonous that shame is. And how healing it is if somebody can talk to you who's not judging you, who's not rejecting you, who's not punishing you, who just says, hey, you got a problem. So that's the actual first step. Then in that context, we need to help people understand themselves and understand their behaviors. Let me tell you a story about myself too. I've been married to my wife Ray now for 39 years, next month. So let's say one night, 10 years ago, I say to Ray, I indicate that I like to have intimate physical contact. Sex. And she says no. And I know that's hard to believe that she would say that to me, but it's happened. How do I react? Well, so I'm 10 years old, I'm 54 years old, 10 years old. And I'm a national medical writer for the Globe and Mail, and I'm a busy family doctor, and I'm a speaker and all this kind of stuff. And director of palliative care at Vancouver, I got all these titles and achievements. So how does this guy respond when his wife says no? Well, in my case, I either go into a rage, or I curl into a fetal ball like this, and I wish that I was dead, and next morning I can't even look her in the eye. No. What sense does that make? What sense does it make when there's nothing to worry about, and that's when you worry? Well, I'll tell you what sense it makes. It has to do with memory. It has to do with the kind of memory called implicit memory. Implicit memory, okay? I'll tell you what that is. There's two kinds of memories in the brain and the body. One kind of memory is what we call recall. And you can call back, recall what you had for breakfast yesterday, what you did 2 weeks ago, what a teacher said to you when you're in grade 5. That's recall. That's called explicit memory. Explicit memory, or recall. But the part of the brain that remembers that way, that encodes or photographs explicit memory, isn't even developed till the 2nd or 3rd year of life. So nobody recalls anything. If I asked you, what did the nurse wear when your mother delivered you, you wouldn't be able to tell me. There's no recall for that. Your brain wasn't even ready to recall that. But there's another kind of memory called implicit memory that's there right from birth. And that's the emotional memory of what happened without the recall. So the emotional experiences are imprinted in your brain, but you don't recall what caused the emotion. Okay? Now, you told us that you were abused, traumatized when you were 2 years old or 1 year old, right? You have no recall for that. But you have memory. The emotional memory, the implicit memory, is here in your brain. Now, what do you think emotionally you were experiencing when nothing was going on, when you were 1.5 years old, but you already been traumatized? Anxiety that something could happen at any time. And you have to pay attention. And if you're not seeing something, maybe that's the most dangerous time of all. There's a kind of thing that happens when children are separated from the mothers. The children, for the first few days, are anxious. They look everywhere for the mom. Then they give up. They get depressed. They won't look anymore. They won't eat. They won't play. They won't do anything. And then after a few days of that, they come out of it. You can feed them again. They'll play again. They'll interact with caregivers. But what happens when the mother comes back? When the mother comes back, they get stressed physically. Their heart rate goes up. They get very tense. And they won't even look at the mother. They won't look at the mother. And what do you think that's about? Well, they don't want to attach in case she leaves again. It's called defensive detachment. And the brain, the kid is not doing it deliberately. The kid's brain is doing it. The kid's brain is saying, when you abandoned me, I felt so hurt that I'll never want to be that hurt again. So I'm never going to connect with you again. Now, when I was 11 months old, my mother gave me to a total stranger in the street and said to her, take this baby away. That's what she did. And she did that to save my life, because she could barely stay alive herself. And I was very sick, and I might have died. So she smuggled me out from the ghetto, and I lived with some relatives for a few weeks until the Germans were defeated and they left Budapest by the Russian army. And then I was reunited. When I read that story about what happens to kids, I asked my mother, how did I respond to you when we were reunited? She said, like an utter stranger, you wouldn't even look at me for several days. Now, my wife says no to me, okay? If I was purely an adult, I would say, okay, that's disappointing, but I can handle it. Because life is disappointment, right? I mean, life is joy, and life is pain, and life is beauty, and life is ugliness, and life is everything, including disappointment. So what? That's just life. But when she says no to me, that memory of being abandoned by my mother gets triggered. Because here's this woman on whom I'm relying in my life, and whom I depend, and I need her to love me and to hold me, and she's saying no to me. That implicit memory gets triggered, and now I'm responding like I'm a 1-year-old child. And by the way, most of the time there's a problem in your relationship with your spouse or with your friends, and you get all upset. It's got nothing to do with the present. You know that, because you go back afterwards and you say, what the heck was that about? And what it was about was implicit memory. That tells you about your childhood. You're back in a state of implicit memory. Now the addicts are always full of implicit memory. So what was the addict's memory? The addict's memory was that he or she was abused by authority figures. So you're an authority figure. And you speak to them in a harsh way. Guess who that makes you? They respond to you like you're the guy abusing them in the first place. And now you can't get to first base. And that means that people working with addicts have to really take care of themselves. They have to be very aware of what's happening internally. Because I tell you what happens to me, when I'm not taking care of myself, let's face it, in a relationship between myself and my clients, who's got the power? I do. I mean, I got the status. If they complain about me, they don't get anywhere. I mean, let a druggie from the downtown east side go to the College of Physicians and make a complaint about a doctor. How far will they get? I'm not saying how it should be, I'm saying how it is. And all their lives, they have never experienced any power at all. So they won't even, they threaten and all that. I don't give them a prescription. Okay, I'm going to the college. Okay, go ahead. So I have to be very careful. Now, when I'm not looking after myself, when I'm very stressed, that means I go to work, and I'm irritable. And so, I'm irritable. What do I trigger? I trigger the implicit memory of another authority figure who just doesn't give a damn about them. And when do I do that most especially? Especially when I myself am not living with integrity. So let me read you a paragraph here. So I told you I've had this propensity to binge on shopping and obsess about it and spend a lot of money. And so when I'm like that, of course, I'm very judgmental of my patients. I'm looking at them saying, how can you be so weak-willed and why don't you just give it up? Exactly what I'm doing myself, right? We always judge other people for exactly we don't deal with it ourselves. In January 2006, when I'm in the midst of an extended CD obsession, and of course when I'm buying compact discs, of course, I become a complete addict. I lie. I bring them home, and my wife says, have you been shopping again? How can you even think such a thing? And I stash it on the porch, and when she goes to sleep, I smuggle it into the house. In January 2006, when I'm in the midst of an extended CD obsession, Sean comes moaning into my office. I'm messing up, he says. I'm puking and shitting. I've been doing heroin. Oh man. Sean has been in a recovery home for months. I haven't seen him for a long time, but he did call regularly, proudly reporting on his progress and his determination to stay clean. Once he left a voicemail, I'm calling to say that I appreciate all your help. I just want to say thanks, man. Now he's back in the downtown east side, pale, bedraggled, emaciated, unwashed. He's been living in the streets for weeks, but plans to admit himself to a Christian rehabilitation camp. Don't you think he should be back on the methadone, I suggest? Sean eagerly downs his first dose before recounting the details of his most recent relapse. I don't know why, Doc. I thought I just used one time, just the one time, and that was it. So we're going through with that Christian rehab thing? My family's pushing me, but I'm not up to it. Have you told them that? No. What stops you from being straight with them? Hurting them. They help me so much. And I turned around and failed so miserably. I'm instantly filled with judgment. Annoyed by his neediness and weakness of will, that is by my own, I want to teach him a lesson. I don't believe you, I countered. Not that you don't mean it, but you're not being honest with yourself. You're not worried about hurting them. You already are hurting them. Yes, I am. But I want to go to that Christian place. I know what it's all about. It's really tough there. The complete schedule. It's harsh and rigid.
Alright, so that gets a little more detail and a little more glow into this central figure for abyssal lights.
You just don't want to face the hassle of being clear with them. You're afraid of their judgment or of your own. You're too chicken to be honest. Sean throws me a direct glance, and a bad smile on his face. That's how it is, Doc. Well then get off it. Be open about what you want and what you don't want. That much.
So that's it for the moment. Have a good night, Earth.
And Doc, having
It's Adam Sturch broadcasting from the Mushroom Mansion, Taos,
will
Mexico.
not go home and lie to his wife.